Institute of Employment Rights event. My name is Carolyn Jones. I'm the director of the Institute of Employment Rights. And my role here tonight is simply to open the meeting and introduce our four wonderful guests. Our format for tonight is slightly different from our standard Institute events. This is an in-conversation event, so it's relaxed, it's informal, but it promises to be very, very informative. The focus of the conversation will be this excellent new book, The Shadow of the Mind. But this obviously is about more than a book. This is about the political and economic journey workers in this country have been on over the last 40 or 50 years. It's about the impact the political, economic and industrial decisions taken by politicians and by the voters who elect those politicians have had on our lives, our jobs and on our communities. Of course, 1 hour couldn't possibly do this book or the decades of research behind it the justice that it deserves. So I'd urge you to go and purchase a copy for yourself of the book. And to help, we've negotiated a special purchase price with the publisher Verso at an incredibly generous 50% discount. Friends of IER can purchase the book for just £10. So pick up the discount code from the link in the chat box. My colleague James will put it there, or let James know and he will sort the order out for you. So there's the plug for the book, and it's well worth the read, I can assure you. So on our panel tonight, we are honoured and privileged to have the two authors of the book join us, Hugh Bainan and Ray Hudson. Both are well renowned for their work. Hugh is Emeritus Professor of Social Science at Cardiff University, while Ray is Emeritus Professor of Geography at Durham. There is so much more I could say about both, but I'm sure the sense of their knowledge and experience will flow from the conversation we are due to have this evening. And to nurture that conversation along, who better to join us than Professor Keith Ewan, who is President of the Institute of Employment Rights, and Lord John Hendy QC, who is IER's Chairman, both keen followers and admirers of Hugh and Ray. But before I pass the screen over to our panel, I'd just like also to thank IER's Treasurer, Jeff Shears. Jeff has done much to bring this event together, including reaching out to his many friends and comrades in the movement to join us tonight. So thanks, Jeff. I can't see you, but I know you're there. So Keith, I believe you're going to open this conversation tonight. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cad. Thank you to the audience, but above all, thank you to Hugh and Ray for having provided us with such a triumph of a book. It's a great book, which, I mean, if I begin at the first page, I mean, it just, even there, that single page is just so full of ambition, which the book sets out to deal with. So I think you make it clear initially that it's a book about the coalfields and the people who live there. You go on to say that the time was ripe for a sympathetic history of how the lives of people in the coalfields has changed, and in doing that, I think you succeed admirably in providing that sympathetic history. But then thirdly, I think what is really intriguing is that you set it in the context of Brexit, and you ask quite hard questions, I think, about the implications of the strike or Brexit in relation to the strike, and also, of course, the 2019 general election and the loss, I suppose, of working class support in many constituencies which otherwise might have voted Labour. So that is, and in doing that, I think, I mean, the connection with Brexit and the 2019 election is, I think, what you say is that you're looking for the deep history of these events, and you're trying to locate that, or at least part of that deep history, back in the events of 1984, 85, and subsequently. So that, I think, is, I mean, just for my benefit, really, just to put it into context for me. But I just wondered, before we go any further, if maybe you would like to set out what it is you are aiming to do, what it is you think you've achieved, what it is the story is that you're telling through this book. I mean, it'd be nice to hear if the people who are listening in, some of whom may not have read the book, and what is it in this book that you're seeking to do?
You want to kick off?
Maybe we could begin with, well, I don't know. Ray, do you want to go first? Or?
No, I was going to say, let Hugh kick off, and then I'll join in.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we've been both in different ways involved in talking with miners and their families and looking at the coalfields, perhaps since we were born in a way, but professionally, certainly since the late 70s when I moved up to Durham and met Ray there. And there's, in 1984, I edited a book called Digging Deeper, which brought together a series of articles by people who were sympathetic to the miners and analysed what was happening and what was likely to happen in the consequence of them losing. And Ray put a piece in there. And subsequent to that, we have been following what the debris, if you like, or fallout of what happened at the end of the strike in '85 with the following closures and so on. And at several points, we thought we ought to write something, and particularly we thought it would be very interesting to compare and write about South Wales and Durham, areas that we both know quite well. But there never seemed to be a moment when it would seem appropriate, really. And then when the Brexit result came out and produced a response which indicated that people thought that the people who lived in South Wales and Durham were in many ways backward, and and the accounts having very little understanding of why on earth people would do such a thing, it made us think that this was a moment when we should perhaps intervene, as it were. And in that, we'd both been influenced by an interesting book that Arlie Hochschild had written in the United States, in a book that was called Strangers in Their Own Land. It was an attempt to explain why workers supported the Tea Party and so on. And while the parallels are not good ones, what she said, which rang with us a bit, was what was needed was an attempt to see reality through the eyes of the people you were talking about and think of their lives and their feelings and how that linked into their politics. And we thought that that was exactly what was needed in the context of the coal miners and the coal fields. And we thought that the deep story she talked about, we could provide as a long story, because the features of the coal fields, as you all know, is that many of the people there have lived there a long time, as have their parents and their grandparents, and the areas are full of stories of the past. And what we've tried to do is explain how, through what we would, I suppose, summarize as great struggles, some great victories, but lots of defeats, and in the last 30 years, false promises, that people came to see the world as they did in the time of the Brexit referendum. Is that
yeah, so I don't know, did Ray want to add anything to that? So
yeah, I think all I would add to that is that if as we examine the decline in support for the Labour Party, you can see peaks in '66 and then a decline and then another peak in '97 and then very rapid decline. And I think in the coalfields, what was particularly important was that I don't think the coal miners and the coalfield communities more generally ever had any hope that they would get effective support from Conservative governments. But with the election in '97 of a Labour government, I think there was a feeling that, okay, maybe now there'll be a turning point and we'll have some serious strategy to deal with the problems of the coalfields and the coalfield communities in an era when coal, deep mining at least, had gone. And I think the disappointment that set in there when it became clear that actually what they were going to get from Blair and New Labour was in some senses not just a continuation of what they've had from Thatcher and the Tory governments, but in some ways was actually even worse than that. So this embracing of globalization, this sense that trying to pretend that globalization was a natural and inevitable process that would sweep through the old coalfield areas, that people just had to accept the consequences of that. Absolutely no recognition of the way in which globalization was a politically constructed process, and that there were ways of intervening which would have changed and had different impacts and more positive impacts in policy terms on the coalfield areas. But that never came under Labour, and I think that serious erosion, if you like, the irreversible erosion, I think sort of can be dated back to that point, and which takes us through to 2015, where I think was very much it was a vote not against Europe. It was a vote against the ruling elites of both parties that appear to have no concern for the conditions of life and the lives of people in the coalfields. And then that translated through again by 2019. Curiously, after, of course, the third high point of support came when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. But the rapid decline of that, for reasons that are understood, and then the Tories being elected with this quite sweeping majority in 2019, I think holds out quite a grim future for the coalfield areas, and indeed other areas that have suffered similarly as a result of the decline of other industries. So
you're tracking back then from 2019 back directly to New Labour and the consequences of that.
I think that the way in which New Labour sought to abandon its traditional constituencies in its search for new sources of electoral support among areas and voters that in the past had voted Conservative, I think, yes, that translated through into a recognition in the coalfields in particular, as we saw from people we talked to, that they had become neglected, that they weren't valued, and that in a sense their only option was almost a protest vote.
Well, that really takes us to a slightly different issue that struck me when I was reading the book, because I mean, I think you say in the very first sentence that the book is about the coalfields and the people who live there. But actually, there's another story in the book as well, and that's about what we might call kind of secondary actors who influence the lives of the people who live in the coalfields and kind of shape the way in which the coalfields develop. And I mean, if you go through the book, then I mean, you're looking at, well, obviously the state, although the state becomes a much more prominent player, I think, during the strike in 84, 85. Secondly, there is the role of the employer in shaping what happens in the coalfields and the lives of the people there. And I was very intrigued by something that you said in the book in relation to nationalisation and to the particular model of nationalisation, I think, which had been adopted in the post-war era, and that was, you referred to it as being a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important insight, I think, for not just to help explain what happened in the past, but also going forward to help explain developments or possible options in the future. Maybe that's something you could reflect on. And the other point that I just wanted to, I'll shut up in a minute, but I just wanted to, the other actor in this process, of course, was the union. And there are issues there about the union that I just wondered if you could, maybe we could explore some of these questions as well. So really my focus, and I'll pass on to John in a minute, but in a sense, just to focus on some of these, if you like, secondary actors who help to shape the lives of people under coalfields, including, as you mentioned, the Labour Party. So I don't know who'd like to come in on that and go back to Ray. Do you want to kick off?
And I'll kick off on that. I think the point you're making there, Keith, is an important one, because what we wanted to do in the book was try and understand what were the processes behind that were leading to the conditions that people experienced. So those secondary actors and the structures in which they were operating, politically and economically, are quite important. So there's a sense in which in the book, what we're trying to do is give an account, if you like, on different levels of the processes that were affecting the coal fields and were being experienced by the people that lived there. The point about nationalisation, maybe I could approach it in this way. What was nationalised was actually the mining of coal. So what wasn't nationalised, for example, were the mining machinery industries, which produced the very profitably from their point of view, which then went on to produce the new machinery that went into the pits, particularly in the 60s. So there were opportunities to have not just nationalize the mining of coal, but to have thought in a more coherent sense about the productive structure that might be taken more into the public sector. So you could have gone back into those industries which produced the means of cutting coal and transporting coal and so on. But you also could have gone forward and looked at the markets for that coal in power generation, in steel, in gas and so on. Now, there is a way in which you could have thought about trying to create a coherent industrial structure and economy, which would have been much more stable and sustainable. The way in which nationalisation happened, of course, was in a context when the British economy was virtually totally dependent on coal as a primary source of fuel. So the priority through to 1958, when oil started to become available, was that the nationalised industry basically, what it had to do was produce as much coal as possible and as cheaply as possible. The idea that actually it might have related in a more structured way to other areas of the economy was never part of the imagination, if you like, of what nationalisation could be. And then, of course, in 58, you get the turning point when all of a sudden oil is available, and the whole question about coal and its future and the coalfield communities and their future is thrown in a very different light. You had the National Plan in 1965, which at one point talked about the need for 400,000 jobs to be shed from the coal industry to provide the assumed expansion of manufacturing industry with the labour it would require. So there was a very, if you like, there's a very instrumental way in which coal and the nationalisation of coal is being thought of. Hugh, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I'd just be interested in this idea of it being a Trojan horse, which was the phrase that you used. I mean, Hugh, I don't know if you could embellish on that. I don't know if it went to the management structures or the relationship between the NCB and the NUM, or, I mean, in what sense was it unhelpful, I guess?
It's interesting to quote what Bill Sears said at the TUC in 1983, when he said that with the best of intentions, we've created, he calls them monsters of destruction, he called them. Destruction of communities. Now, what is it that makes? Why is that? And it clearly what happened in the 60s, and then what happened 84 and afterwards, is the state-owned industry, with a change in government policy, used all the levers of the state in order to transform employment, and the impact of that, I think, on the British economy has been understated really, because in the 60s, 400,000 jobs left the sector. There was without one strike against it. Different ways in which many of the miners just left, and what that produced was an idea that restructuring was quite easy. The NCB was heralded across the world as someone who was an industry that was capable of transforming an economy, and the idea that economic change was something that could be easily produced through in this way was levered through by the state. And I think a lot of sadness followed from that, I think, because if you look at the data, you see that the coal fields never properly recovered, in spite of there being a much greater attempt to regenerate them than there has recently, and these areas became a peripheral in the way that they were seen in the 30s, and that I could go on, of course, but with regard to the union, I think the one of the tragedies of it is that is how nationalization was what the union really wanted in 1947, and they would do almost anything to ensure, or the officials would, to ensure that the industry was successful, or nationalization was successful, and that well, all of that led up to 1972, actually. So it's in a way, because it caused great tension between the union leaders and the membership, and it was handled in different ways in different areas. And the contrast between Durham and South Wales is really interesting in that regard.
Yeah, that close relationship, I think, comes out very, very vividly in the book. And there's some really surprising examples of it. I mean, which you tell. I mean, it really is. Some of it's quite shocking, I think. I mean, the level of well, they wouldn't see it as collusion, I suppose. I mean, it was just a kind of symbiotic relationship between the union and the board, in a way that perhaps in modern employment terms we probably wouldn't understand. But when things began to fall apart, I just wonder, I mean, to what extent was it's really interesting, some of the points that you make about the union and some of the, I guess, the contradictions about the union which emerged, which in a sense tended to weaken its position. And I'm just thinking about the federal structure, which seemed to have a number of problems. I'm thinking about the political divisions between the different areas, again, which you paint between Durham and South Wales. The local variations, again, you've got constant problems going back to the 1920s in relation to Nottinghamshire. And the other point I think that struck me was in all these big ballots, the very narrow margins in terms of support or otherwise for industrial action. I just wondered if in writing the book, you were, in a sense, you had any thoughts about the contribution which the union made or failed to make, or things that might have done better, in terms of the story that you tell about the lives of the people. I mean, how well were the people served by the structure, organization, and activities of the union?
There's so much to say. In one regard, the one you pick up, the history of mining is a history of district unions that amalgamate and then come together in a federation, and the dream of the union leaders is to create a national union, which is what they did in 1944. But the structure of the national union retained within it those areas, those previous district structures. So you had and with that a degree of variation in practice in terms of the union. Then, I mean, what built around that, and international studies of trade unions in the 50s noted the NCB, the NUM, as being significant, and in the way it was organized around a series of regional alliances and cabals, politically organized, so that there was in the union, I think all unions have lefts and rights, but in the miners' union there was a left and a right, and they cohered separately, met separately, and divided on an NEC separately, and Durham became, in an odd sort of way, on the right and South Wales on the left, and that tension held the union together, and without too much disasters really, until one of the actors, Bill Painter, who was a communist from South Wales, decided that what was really needed was two things. One is to build a proper national union. He prepared the document and the president refused to table it at the NEC.
Mm.
And the other thing he thought would be to move away from piece rates and to have a day rate for the whole of the industry. And that was signed in 1966. And it lasted for, it was a great achievement. It lasted about 9 years. And so what that kind of district, the federal structure then did was to allow, through the connivance of the president called Joe Gormley, a series of votes to introduce a new incentive scheme. And the incentive scheme was pushed forward by the Labour government in get the dates right, in 1975, in order to increase production. And when I talked to Dennis Skinner in 1980, he said to me, 1982, he said to me, they're producing too much coal, and they ought to do what the old miners say, leave some for tomorrow. And it was we write in the book, I think, there was this kind of strange feeling of the miners digging the end of the industry, really, because the when the strike started in '84, there was a huge amount of stockpiling. The other, I'm beginning to give a speech now, but the other part of it, which we might come on to later, is the relationship between the union and the board in relation to the health and safety of the workers. And we really feel that, I think that is quite damning in a way. And throughout the book, we see the state as a major actor. And if anything's moved me about writing it or going through it, is the sense of a degree of cruelty, really, in the way in which the state has operated. There's certainly, given that mining was so central to the British economy, such 750,000 miners, you cannot say that the miners were in any way looked after or taken care of or given any special privileges, really. Everything that was given to them with clenched, tight hands, I think.
And I think that's a good, cruelty is a good word. And what struck me, I was trying to find a word to describe it. I mean, I was thinking about an abdication or a lack or unwillingness to accept any responsibility on the part of the state. But I think cruelty is better. Ray, did you want to come in and add to that? And I'm going to pass on to John. So
no, I think the issue that Hugh came around to there, which was the way in which the health consequences of underground mining, and particularly the effects of pneumoconiosis and so on, which of course, as the mines became more mechanized, there was more dust in them, that became more serious. The way that those problems were swept under the carpet, became tied up with a compensation scheme that in no way was adequate to meet the needs of the people who were affected by it. And for an industry that nationalization was meant to be about, the mining people mining coal for the people, providing energy for the people and so on, to neglect the health of the workers in the way that they did, and the way actually that senior union officials connived in this disguising or refusing to admit the extent of the health problems, I think was really shocking. And go back to the point about the Trojan horse. It was a Trojan horse in a number of ways, that it was meant to, nationalization was meant to guarantee the future of the industry, was meant to provide jobs for miners, was meant to improve their health and their working conditions. And in fact, it did quite the opposite. Their health deteriorated, the jobs disappeared, and ultimately nationalization became the prelude to privatization and the disappearance of the industry considerably, entirely. So it's in that sense that I think the notion of the Trojan horse, something that came in, if you like, under the radar, by the back door, and it was fundamental to ironically, to the ending of the industry.
Right. Before I just pass on to John, let me just point to the chat box. There's a nice quote there from Charlie Bell, as a former miner, I've got to say we never really felt that we were part of a nationalized industry. I was no different from working for any other large industrial company. And that's very like a sentiment that's expressed on page 38 of the book, in I think the interviews that were done by John Rex, which you referred to. I mean, that's exactly the point that was being made there. But anyway, I'm going to pass on to John. Sorry for having gone on so long.
Oh, thanks, Keith. Yeah, can I ask you about the nationalisation? Do you have any thoughts about the way in which the nationalisation involved the miners themselves? I mean, the crucial section of the Coal Industry Act was Section 46, which requires consultation with those organisations of the workers which appear to the Secretary of State representative. And that is the only involvement that the workers had in nationalisation in that statute. It was reproduced in all the other nationalisation statutes of the 1940s. Of course, as it is, as we see it today, we'd be begging for it in any bloody industry to have an obligation to consult. But there was no involvement in the actual running of the organisation. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about that, because I'm struck, as everybody is, by the irony of the fact that in the 84-85 strike, if they had been private coal owners, the union would have won, and it would have won well within a year. It was only because it was a nationalised industry and that the government could take the losses that the miners were ultimately defeated. Maybe if they'd been running it, it might have been different.
It wasn't just
go on, Hugh. No, go on.
It wasn't just the coal mines that were nationalised. Of course, the CGB was nationalised, and the CGB spent an extra £25 million on oil to burn in the coal stations during that strike. And the thing about that strike is that the whole of the apparatus of the state was brought together, really, because they did a special deal with which I'll say something about later if you want, with the workers in those plants. But in terms of the involvement, there's a quotation from a man. What they did in 47, as you know, was to often to get the oldest man and the youngest boy to pull a flag up to unveil a plaque and pull the flag up the post. And one of the men in the Easton pit in Durham said the flag went up the post and we went down the pit, we went down the shaft. And I think that was something. I think the act of Parliament was brilliant for the union because it recognised the union, and for the union officials, that Sam Watson, for example, thought of the consultation and conciliation scheme of the board to be an act of absolute beauty, because it was just, given what they'd been through in the 30s, it was just heaven, really. And they insisted that they wanted the men to abide by it. And hence what the big problem in that period was of unofficial strikes. And well, you know, John, that in that period, the series of that were kept by the Department of Employment on strikes kept the coal industry separate, because it was overwhelmed by unofficial strike action. And I think what Mr. Bell has said is true, that is that in the pit, I think some bullying was curtailed, but in the pit, many people said they faced the same managers. And I think what we point out is that a lot of the union officials had gone over to become industrial relations officers. So you had this kind of parallel system, really, and you had sort of ex-union officials negotiating with union officials in all of the areas, actually. So it was an amazing construction that came out of that period, which came out of the 30s. And
I think all I would add to that, and it goes back to Keith's point about this that you made initially about this sense of involvement. I talked to my dad about what he made of nationalisation, and I'll slightly modify the language of his response. But the essence of it was that the same people were telling him to go down the pit the day after nationalisation as they were telling him to go down the pit the day before nationalisation. And as far as he could see, it hadn't made much difference at all in the way that he actually experienced life and work in the colliery.
Yeah,
I think
there's been more involvement of the workers in the actual running of the National Coal Board. It might perhaps have been different. I mean, they because of the structure of the Coal Industry Act, they built in, as you say, what they call a conciliation scheme, collective bargaining arrangements. But no involvement in the running of it. There was no workers controlled.
No, not at all. No, not at all. That was never discussed.
You mentioned in the book the butty system, which operated in Nottinghamshire.
Yeah.
I guess speaking to family, I mean, one of the achievements of nationalisation was that it established for many people who previously didn't have it a regular working week, the elimination of the agent, who was a hated figure in many coalfields. So for some workers, I mean, in the sense, for some miners, not all presumably, but at least for some in some coalfields, there were some tangible benefits for which many people, I guess, were extremely pleased with. Well, I think, I mean, John's point, I think, is, I guess, I mean, there was no, the trick that was missed, in a sense, unlike, say, in Germany, where there was representation of the union in the running of the industry.
Yeah.
And the question is, what difference that kind of model would have made when we got to the events of, well, it's the 70s, well, from 58 onwards, as you mentioned, when all arrived on the scene, and right through to the strike and thereafter. And so I guess, I mean, that's the trick that was missed, I think, the short-sightedness at the time.
Well, they had Citrine on the board and they had Ebby Edwards on the board. So they didn't have a co-determined structure, but I think the problem was the union was so completely supportive of the structure, and urged the workers to support it. And I think that, and then when the closures came in the 60s, they did the same, really. It was, but there were benefits, when the act came out, of course, the union then realised there wasn't much in it for the miners, so they produced the miners' charter, in which they made these demands and made Shinwell in the end go to the cabinet and insist that they had a wage increase and a reduction in the length of the working week, and also more holidays. So it wasn't in a way designed to help the workers.
Yeah.
If I could just pick up the point you made about Germany, Keith, because it's quite interesting. I mean, if you look at what happened there with Ruhrkohle and the rundown of the deep mines under private ownership in the Ruhr, it was done in a way that actually had a transition program onto a new economic base, which very much hinged around environmental technologies, which used the skills that people had developed within the coal industry and so on. And over a period of 5 years, if you like, before a pit was going to shut, there would be a phased transition into other forms of economic activity. Now, there was nothing like that.
Yeah.
And the irony, of course, is that you got that under private ownership.
Yeah.
But you couldn't get it under nationalisation.
Yeah.
I always thought that was that abandonment of the coal mining communities as they closed the industry down was a reflection of something that McGregor said during the strike. He said, "This is insubordination."
Absolutely.
And they will
pay for it.
This is still part of the price that they're paying, this endless abandonment. With still nothing is offered to them even now. And
a new, much harsher regime underground in the pits. Different arrangements. So I mean, the operative word, John, was the one you mentioned, which was punishment. and they were going to suffer in every way that conceivable that they could think up, above the ground and below the ground.
Yeah. Can I raise something else which sort of touches on that? In the pits that I had the opportunity to go down years ago now, as it of course it is, but I was really struck by the inadequacy of the facilities that were provided. Pithead baths, yes, but no hint of luxury. I mean, I always imagined, I'd always been brought up to believe that the miners were the vanguard of the labour movement and so on, and then I thought they'd be walking on carpets to the to the lift shaft, but not at all. And of course, the unions did procure things, as you say, a shorter working day and a shorter working week and more holidays and retirement at 55 and things like that. But a lot of it was sort of paternalism, wasn't it? I suppose there's a long history of paternalism in the coal industry, but the miners didn't get a lot out of it, did they? I mean, they got miners' welfares, that's true, but they didn't get a lot else out of the sacrifices they made. I'm talking about the period from 1946 onwards.
I wouldn't underestimate, though, the significance of things like pithead baths for the wives and daughters of miners who no longer had to provide constant hot water for people coming in from 2 and 3 shifts at different times in the day and so on. So things that might appear relatively minor, if you like, in terms of life in the miner's home, and particularly the conditions of the women and the wives in those places, I think was quite significant that the pithead baths were provided. The question might be, why weren't they provided a dam site earlier than they were?
Yeah, but they weren't able to procure a sort of guarantee of a standard of life after the job was finished, for example, which one might have thought that was obtainable. I suppose, of course, the pressure to get higher wages at the time probably surpassed the longer interest. And I know that it was a big battle to get the age of retirement down, which was constantly being overtaken by more immediate goals.
Yeah. Hugh, do you want to?
Yes, safe to say that in the 60s they were opening baths and closing pits, more or less, one after the other, really. So it's so it's one of the things we shouldn't forget about the way we've written the book is that we do write it about the men and women of the coalfields, and we make the point very early on that coal mining under private enterprise couldn't have operated without domestic labour, without the women, really, and it simply couldn't have worked. And where you don't have domestic labour, you end up with in South Africa, for example, you have to these huge migrant camps where all those facilities have to be provided. So it's the coal production regime was one which, in fact, was in which the work of the women was quite central to it, and
there are people on the call who I think would like you to speak about how the role of women changed in the industry and in the coal fields, perhaps as a result of the strike, or is this something that you in the strike or and subsequently? So, I mean, in a sense, to what extent was the strike a transformative moment in that sense, or were these changes already in hand? I mean, I think you do refer to some, partly because of the closures that, in a sense, there was higher levels of female levels of employment. So in a sense, that would have an impact. But then there are also the issues around the strike. But so in a sense, there are three aspects to the story, I think, which you tell in the book. I mean, going back to the private pre-war days,
Yeah.
which were just utterly grim. In the 60s, when in a sense the closures were beginning to take place and family incomes were beginning to fall, and then there was a big impact which we read about or we learn about, which was caused by the strike itself. Were these issues that any sense of continuity or any of change or aspects relating to the role of women that you picked up in the course of the book or the study of the material for the book?
Yeah, well, I think something that does run through the book, if you think about it when you read through it, is this relationship between men and women, and how that operated in relation to coal mining. And so in the period up until through nationalisation until I suppose the late 50s, there was a very strict division of labour on the coalfields, which was there was very few employment opportunities for women. In the 30s, of course, women who daughters often had to leave the coalfields to work as maids, as there was no opportunities for them to work on the coalfields. There was some, but as the mines began to close, new industries were attracted in the 60s, and often this were assembly plants in which employed women, and we interviewed a lot of women in one of the factories, Zip factory in Durham, in the late 70s, and so there was a change taking place as women's role was altering, if you like. And when the strike broke out, a significant number of women became very active in the dispute, and some of them had been very active before in different ways, many of them not, and many of them talked about how it changed their lives and talked very movingly about that, and we quote from them. But they were probably a minority of the women. Many more of the women, I think, took on more jobs during the strike, extended their hours or went back to work. One woman said how she returned to work and never went back. Never went back to the house. And so, in the period after the strike, with the huge rundown, tremendous way in which the pits were closed, men laid off. All the data we've got, and collected by us partly, but collected by lots of other people, found that the miners, by and large, who found work, were earning £100 a week less than they were in the pit, and that with their wives returning to work, were working still with less money than they had when they were in the colliery. But what was happening more generally was that women were becoming much more active in the labour force, and in both areas, South Wales and Durham, are just over 50% now, which has given quite significant interesting differences in the way in which domestic life is organised and how the relationship between men and women operates. And there's some very interesting quotations from women about how that's come about, and the sense that there's been a shift in power. One man in Mountain Ash said to us that when the pit was working, everything was run by the lodge. Now it's all run by the women, and it's he resented that, but others did so much.
Yeah. He used to tell people what to do, and now the women told him what to do.
Yeah, he was a deputy. Yeah.
But I think what Hugh's getting at there also is quite a fundamental, if you like, structural change in the labour market of the two coalfields. So the women, in a sense, moved from providing absolutely crucial domestic labour in the home when the pits were open, to actually becoming, in many cases, increasingly the primary income earner in coalfield families after the pit shut. But a lot of the new jobs that were provided, that women took, weren't well paid. They were often part-time. They were often precarious. A lot of them were in services, both public sector services and public sector services that became privatized, like care homes and so on. So the consequence of this, in a sense, was that many households were increasingly dependent upon female wage labour. didn't necessarily mean that the women were doing less in the home in the way of domestic labour. But you had a situation where the standard of living of those mining families would have declined, because the even if the guy found a job and his wife found a job, chances are the household income would be less than what he used to bring home from the colliery. So the whole nature of the ability to then engage in social activities outside the home, to go down the club at the weekend for a few beers, all that was affected both within the home and outside the home as a consequence of the way in which the structure of the coalfield economies had changed. As Hugh said, that they first became peripheral coalfields, then there weren't coalfields at all. There were simply former coalfields in which people were trying to find ways of getting by as best they could.
It's the in writing about the strike, Raymond Williams, we quote, is a famous Welsh theorist, wrote and said that what the miners were experiencing, the rest of the working class will experience. And I thought of that when I heard the Tory lady talk about how the Honda workers were going to be faced up to the realities of life now the plant had closed. Because what happened to the coal miners is that they left, it made so clear how important the coal industry was as a source of secure wage labor with a relatively high wage. And what they went into was agency work and a whole range of kind of purposeless work as they saw it. And I see that there's a nice note from David Parry on the phone, on the chat. Hello, Dave. We do write in the book about Tower, and he's pointing out that there were attempts in Yorkshire and Scotland and Wales, when the pits were closed down, to take over the pits as under workers' control. And we write about how that worked at Tower. Tower was quite the problems they had at Thurcroft, I think, is the big problem that workers trying to take over the mines themselves is, where did the coal go? And it was all tended to be tied up by the CGB. And Tower was quite favorably placed, and David went to Tower and wrote about it. So it's there were those themes, and within the mining industry for workers' control, big debates between Arthur Scargill and the Institute of Workers' Control right through the 70s over quite different approaches to it. But there were attempts after as the mines were closing down for men and their families, incidentally, to want to take the mine over. And as I say, we write about Tower in that regard, as old ideas coming back into the fore.
We're rapidly running out of time, but can I ask a question about the mining unions today? Because the unions obviously had a huge role up until each pit was closed, and we saw in the strike votes and debates about whether to accept redundancy and so forth. And now there's been no alternative. But the union representation has gone on, particularly in Durham, in fighting for members' ill health compensation and universal credit and stuff like that. I just wonder whether you guys could say something about the continued impact of the mining unions today in the coal fields.
Well, it varies.
Yeah, go on, Hugh.
It varies, and of course, because the mining unions and the lodge related to what went on in the mine, and to some extent what went on outside the mine, they had this continued role. And in South Wales, the lodges had compensation secretaries, and they continued after the mines closed. In Durham, well, without going into the details of how the union changed from being a union to a charity, they continued, and in other areas, to fight issues relating to miners' compensation. And particularly in relation to Vibration White Finger, which they won significantly. Most importantly, though, was the cases brought together around emphysema and COPD, in which some of the most coruscating decisions I've seen in a court, where Justice Turner describes the way in which management in the coal mines deliberately operated the mines for production and without concern for the welfare of the men, and followed up with the case for the coke workers, whereas a female judge gives the very same account of a disregard for the health and safety of the workforce, and that these should come out after the mines closed, after everything closed, and it relates in part to the reluctance of the union to really take on these issues by going to the courts. They relied ever so much on having boards to settle these matters, and consequently, I think the union has in both the areas we write about, but particularly in Durham, has retained this kind of concern for the welfare of the workers, and obtained significant compensation. I'm astonished that the level of compensation they get for Vibration White Finger is far better than they get for pneumoconiosis.
That's because I did that case.
I know, you're just wonderful, John.
I think on a more positive note, if you like, well, no, a differently positive note. Of course, the reformed union in the Durham Miners Association is actually also playing an important role in trying to keep the Miners' Gala going and trying to develop Red Hills really as a centre in which the culture and of the coalfields, the history of that can be recorded, and it can provide a resource, if you like, in which people from the coalfield communities can come together and maybe think about alternative futures now in the absence of coal. So there is that positive element alongside winning the cases over compensation and bad health and so on. So, yeah.
Can we go on for another 10 minutes, Cad, or are we stuck at 7?
That's up to you. I mean, we can talk for as long as we have an audience, I mean, but you know, it's we did say an hour, but
it's best to do it, I think.
Well, can I just ask one question arising out of the last issue you discussed? Because I remember during the strike going to South Wales and meeting, because I did all the civil litigation during the strike. I remember meeting branch secretary of a Welsh-speaking pit who told me that branch secretaries in quite remote parts were held in very high esteem in the community, and he'd even been called upon in marital disputes and things like that. So this was obviously a very important community function that was held by elected union representatives outside the workplace. And I wonder whether, do we assume that all that's gone now? Must have done, I suppose.
Well, it does and it doesn't. In some places it's done. It's interesting. One of the things that Ray and I bring out in the book is how interesting geography has played a role in two different areas, because in South Wales the mines were distributed quite evenly across the valleys and closed down relatively evenly, so that there wasn't a valley without a pit, if you like. Whereas in Durham, the mines closed from the west to the east. So by the time of the strike, I mean, a lot of miners were traveling 20 miles from Bishop Auckland across to Easington, if you like. And nowadays, and this comes back to Northwest Durham voting Tory, and nowadays those areas have been denuded of the structures of the union, whereas where the pits were opened more recently, the lodge still has a function. And I think we talk about that in the book, about the lodge secretaries are still have people in their front rooms and meeting people in the clubs to give advice on whatever seems to be important to them, really. So it was always a community union before we began talking of community unionism, I think, in as much as the union had a real presence beyond the pit. And of course the industry had a presence beyond the pit, and we haven't mentioned the disaster at Aberfan, which I think was quite critical to how
Yes, absolutely.
nationalisation began to be seen.
And Robbins, yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, I mean, it says we've dealt with we've looked at the state, the employer, the union, looked at the role of the law to some extent, but the elephant in the room, I guess, is the Labour Party, whether as a party of government or as a party of opposition. Labour Party historically, Labour Party today. I mean, do you have any comments, points you'd like to make about the role of the Labour Party in the decline of the mining communities, in the sense, I presume, of disappointment, which people must have felt? I mean, given the paradox here, the contradiction here, I think, is that the union invested so much in this idea of political unionism, which you pull out. Yet that sense of political unionism, to some extent, it could be argued, was a downfall, or contributed to the downfall of the organisation.
Yeah.
Well, certainly, what we say of someone like Sam Watson, for example, is that it was said of Will Painter that he was a communist who believed in the union more than the party. But with Watson, it seemed the other way around, really, that they believed in the party more than the union. And certainly, when the party was in government, they gave the party enormous support. And of course,
but that would be union, to some extent, union failings. What about Labour Party failings? I mean, I think you are critical of Blair and Brown. But what about the current generation of Labour leaders?
You have to remind
what lessons can they learn from this experience?
Well, it's been suggested that Keir Starmer needs to read our book, but maybe that's not quite what you mean.
I think this is too late in the day to get drawn on this, but they certainly needs to stop going around talking to focus groups. And what people want from the Labour Party is for them to do something for them, you know. And all the time we've got is too little, too late. Promises never kept. New things coming that never happen. Money from the European Union that we don't want, why don't they do things that we want? Why don't they do things for us? That we have somehow got left behind. And there's that wonderful quote from Laura wrote, which we quote at the end of it, that when she went around, these are around the doors of course, it's changed a lot because the Derwent Valley is different now. There's lots of commuting, but it does have the village of Chopwell, which was called Little Moscow in the 30s and 20s, and the Concert Iron and Steelworks and such like. And she was finding people saying to her, "We don't want to listen to you. We don't believe in you. You've taken everything from us." And when Dick Clegg went to Ebervale to sort out the people there, to tell them why they should have voted to stay and not to leave. He left. I think he actually learned something when he went there, because he said that what he'd seen there was that people had lost something that they know couldn't be retrieved, and that what they were given was things they didn't want. And it was this kind of tragic element to it all, really, which is, I think, is beyond the political brain. And but this idea, that Michael, the famous actor,
Michael Sheen.
Michael Sheen, and he saved the Braemar cinema. That meant more to people than a lot of the big schemes, really. That it felt that he'd done something. This idea that we began with, people's feelings and how they feel about how they're treated, and this idea of cruelty. I mean, this is patterned into it all, really, and it's just, it's and when we're talking, we would say, I suppose, both of us, if you wanted to start where we need to build things up from the bottom again, or the rest of it, but we don't need to build things up from the bottom again to create another edifice. We need to build with people, you know, through their wants and needs and understandings rather than what we think, you know.
Yes, I
It's
think
interesting that it comes back to John's points in sense. It's interesting that union officials have retained respect, whereas local Labour Party activists or representatives have not. I think that comes through in the book as well. We're giving that example of Michael Sheen.
I think I think what Hugh is fundamentally saying, and I think is fundamentally correct, is a need to rebuild with people rather than for people. So that needs to be some sense of involvement and engagement and ownership, and a feeling that actually what we think matters and what we would like will be taken into consideration, rather than this is what we're handing down to you from Westminster.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or from County Hall.
Or from County Hall.
Yeah.
Which of course in Durham is just moving to the city centre. Quite controversially.
Very good.
Cad, have we
Yeah.
reached an appropriate moment?
I think that we have. That was excellent. Well, I said at the introduction that this was going to be a very, very interesting talk, and you haven't disappointed in the slightest. That was brilliant. The book is great. It's really excellent, but it's even better to hear it from you. It's just a shame that this isn't live, so I could get you to sign my copy of the book. But maybe I'll bring it with me when we go to Durham Gala next year.
Oh, we'll have to come up to Liverpool to see you.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. My door is always open. As I said, I've got no pets and no kids, so there's lots of room. So feel free to come to Liverpool. It's been great. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. It's just been an honour. I'm sure there will be lots of sales of your book. We will promote it. We will circulate the video. Sorry to everybody that I didn't explain at the beginning. There would be no questions, but I think John and Keith have taken care of all the questions that needed asking. So thank you very much. We shall be in touch in the future, and we hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Ed, could you send me the chat?
I can.
Thanks.
I will.
Thanks, love.
Yeah. It'll go out to everybody with a link to this video.
Because there's some messages to us haven't been picked up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll do that, Hugh. No problem.
Thanks very much.
Grant, thank you very much indeed.
Cheers, Ray.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.